If we take a look at the booking reserve method, it's going to create a new booking instance, but it's also going to raise a new booking reserve domain event. We definitely want to handle this event somehow, and we're actually going to do that from the application layer. I prefer placing handlers for domain events in the same folder where the respective command lives, so let's go ahead and define our domain event handler inside of this folder. I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it Booking Reserve Domain Event Handler. So the naming convention that we are using is pretty consistent. We always specify what is the command, query, or event, and then we append handler. I'm going to make this internal and sealed. The dependency injection configuration that we added for Mediator is going to take care of wiring up this class, and all we have to do is implement the iNotification handler interface and specify our domain event. So we have the booking reserved domain event, and let's go ahead and implement it. Inside of this command handler, we want to send an email notification to the user that just reserved this apartment, saying that they have 10 minutes to confirm this booking, otherwise it's going to be automatically canceled by the system. So let's go ahead and inject what we're going to need to handle this event. I'm going to use the iBooking repository first. Let's add a field, and I'm also going to add the iUser repository to fetch the respective user. And then I'm going to need an abstraction for sending emails. I'm going to call it iEmail service. This is something that we didn't yet define in our system, so let's go ahead and do that. Inside of the abstractions folder, I'm going to add one more folder, which I will call email. We're going to add the interface for the email service inside. So let's create the iEmail service, and it's going to have one method, which is going to be asynchronous, and we're going to call it sendAsync. We're going to give it two arguments. One is going to be the email, and we're going to use the email value object here to represent our recipient. So let's give it the appropriate name. Then we're going to give it two more arguments for the subject and the body of the email. We could wrap these two into an object, but there's not much value in it because this is a simple email service and we're not really going to be implementing it. So if I head back to the booking reserved domain event handlers, now we can inject the email service. So let's generate the constructor and inject the dependencies that we need. I'm going to align them vertically so you can see what we have. So we're getting the booking repository, the user repository, and the email service. Now let's implement the handle method. The first step is going to be fetching the booking from the repository. We're going to call the getById method, give it the booking ID, and then if the booking is null, we're just going to return from this method because something went wrong, and in reality, it should never be null. Then we are going to fetch the user by calling the user repository getById method. We're going to use the user ID on the booking object and send an email to that user. So we're going to say email service, send async. We're going to pass it the user email, and then we need to say what are the subject line and the body. The subject line can be booking reserved, and the body of this email can be you have 10 minutes to confirm this booking. This is what the implementation of a domain event handler would look like. We're currently leveraging repositories, and this isn't the most performant approach. This is something that we can live with in our command handlers, but you have to ask yourself if this is the approach that you want to take in the event handlers. In this case, I think it's justified, but you could also use the same approach that we're going to use for query handlers, and that is executing SQL queries on the database directly using Dapr. So let's implement our first query. I'm going to start by adding a feature folder for our query. I'm going to call this feature getBooking, and we're going to define a class inside or a record which is going to represent the query object. I'm going to call it getBookingQuery, and this is what the definition of this query is going to look like. We're going to have the booking ID as the argument. This is the booking that we are trying to get from the database, and this query is going to return a booking response object. I don't have this object yet, but I'm going to add it, and this is what it's going to look like. For the query responses, we want to be using primitive types as much as possible, and we want a very flat structure which we can easily return from the database. All of these properties are already present on the booking, however, they are hidden behind the rich domain model and value objects. Now, all that's left to do is to add the respective query handler for our getBooking query. We're going to add another class inside of the getBooking feature folder, and I'm going to call it getBooking query handler. I'll make it internal and sealed, and we're going to implement the iQueryHandler interface. I'll specify the getBooking query as the query argument, and I'm going to provide the booking response as the result returned by this query. Now we can implement the query handler interface and implement the handle method. We're going to be using Dapr for writing our queries, so we need to add the Dapr NuGet package. I'm going to go ahead and install it in the application project, and I need a way to get a database connection so that I can execute queries using Dapr. To be able to achieve this, I'm going to define another abstraction inside of a new folder, which I will call data, and let me define an interface that I will call iSQL Connection Factory. This interface is going to have just one method, which is called createConnection, and it returns a new database connection to my SQL database. I'm going to be using Postgres under the hood, but you could be using any other SQL database that you want. Now, inside of my getBooking query handler, I need to define my SQL Connection Factory field and generate a constructor to inject this field. And then our handle method is going to look like this. First, we're going to call the createConnection method to get back a database connection object. We're going to specify it inside of a using statement so that it gets disposed when our handle method completes. Executing a query with Dapr is very simple. You just call one of the many extension methods that are exposed on the database connection interface. In this case, we are using queryFirstOrDefault async. This method accepts a generic argument, which is our booking response, and we are loading it directly from the database. I'm also passing a SQL query, which is currently missing, and an anonymous object containing my parameters for this query, which is the booking ID, because I'm trying to fetch the booking by the ID. I'm also going to add the SQL query inside of a constant string. Now you don't have to pay much attention to it. It's a typical select query from the bookings table. We have a where statement looking for the specific record with the booking ID that we specified, and we are just projecting the columns of this table into the respective properties on our booking response class. This is the trade-off that I'm making and why I consider this the pragmatic clean architecture. We're using SQL to directly access our read model and return the response from our query without any indirection. The downside is that we are not completely abstracting our persistence concerns, in this case a SQL database, from our query handlers, but the benefits are just too many to count. First of all, this is very simple. All we need is to create a database connection, write our SQL statement, and execute the query with Dapr, which is a few lines of code. Then this is going to be really performant because Dapr is one of the fastest object mappers out there, and there's also the benefit of being able to define your read models at the database level by defining database views. This is something that your SQL developer can take care of, and you just consume the views without having to write very complicated queries in your code. The standard argument of not being able to switch a database without an abstraction really doesn't make a lot of sense, because first of all, if you are switching databases, you have a lot more problems than just using SQL in the application layer. Second, if you end up moving from a SQL database to something like a document database or a column store, you're going to have to rewrite your entire persistence layer, so an abstraction wouldn't really save you here. And lastly, if you do decide to introduce an abstraction to just wrap all of the code that we have here, then your query handlers become pointless. They would just be wrappers around the query service that is delegating all of the work to the infrastructure project, for example, but the query handlers themselves wouldn't have any added value. So at that point, you could consider getting rid of the query handlers altogether. I want to show you a more involved query example. So I'm going to add another feature folder in the application project, and I'm going to call it apartments. I'm going to add a folder inside which is going to hold my search apartments query. Let me create a record inside of this folder which is going to be called search apartments query. Here's what the implementation of this query would look like. I have two arguments which are the start and end date, and essentially this query is supposed to return a list of apartments that are available for this date range. The return type is going to be a read-only list of apartment responses, and this is a type that I don't have yet. I'm going to introduce the apartment response inside of this folder. This is what it looks like. It contains the basic information of our apartment, like the name, description, price, and currency, and I also have a nested object inside representing my address. For the address, I'm going to add another object, which is the address response, and this is very similar to our value object that we have in the domain layer, except we are using it to represent the apartment response that we are returning from our query. Let's define the query handler for the search apartments query. So I'm going to add the search apartments query handler class. I'll make this class internal and sealed, and we have to implement the iQueryHandler interface. I'm going to specify the search apartments query as the first argument, and the second argument is going to be an iRead-only list of apartment responses. Now I can go ahead and implement my query. I'm going to start by injecting the SQL connection factory, similarly to what we did in the previous query. Then I'm going to implement my handle method, and first of all I'm going to check if the start date is larger than the end date. In that case, I'm just going to return an empty list. Otherwise, I'm going to create my SQL connection to the database. I'm going to add my SQL query, which is responsible for fetching the apartments that are available for this date range. I'm using a not-exists query to query the bookings based on our conditions, and I'll explain what this is in just a moment. Here's the code that's sending the query to the database and mapping the response into the apartment response. So we're using an interesting feature of Dapr that allows us to query multiple objects from the database. We are querying for an apartment response and an address response, and the final result is an apartment response type. We pass in our SQL query, and then we have a function that allows us to handle the projection from the database. So if you take a look here, these are the properties that are relevant for the apartment itself, and then these properties over here are related to the address. We can determine that the address starts from the country column, so we are telling that to Dapr by specifying the split on value to be country, and what Dapr is going to do is it's going to map these properties here into one object and these properties here into the second object. So the first one is going to be our apartment and the second is going to be the address. And lastly, we just want to stitch them together by saying that the apartment address is the address returned in the same row. What's missing here is an array containing the active booking statuses. So we want to check that there are no active bookings for this date range, and this is just going to be an array containing these booking statuses. So the active statuses are reserved, confirmed, and completed, and if a booking was rejected or cancelled, then the apartment is available for booking. This is a more involved example of a query, and this could also be handled by a database view. And the interesting point is the powerful mappings that you can achieve with Dapr. Now that we added some commands and queries, let's talk about implementing cross-cutting concerns in the application layer.